It started with a typo. At least, that's what I thought at first. I was finalizing the presentation for our annual leadership summit, double-checking last-minute edits on the shared company drive. My boss had left his account open on one of the meeting room computers, not unusual. But there it was, in the corner of a document, under a tab labeled Priorities Q4, my name. Not under Core Team or Strategic Leads. I was under a section marked Side Projects. In parentheses, Low Visibility, Temporary. I stared at it for a full minute. Side project? I had been leading that initiative for 7 months. I built the timeline, negotiated resources, met every milestone. I was on late calls with suppliers, caught mistakes that would have cost thousands, trained new hires myself when no one else volunteered. And now I was, low visibility. My hands were cold. I closed the document quietly and pretended nothing had happened. But the label sat in my chest like a weight. That's what I was to him, a background task. A bonus item. A thing to mention only if there was time left on the agenda. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about every time he'd complimented me in front of others. "She's keeping everything afloat," he once said. Total lifesaver. But it was just convenient language. Performance padding. Praise without power. By the next morning, I'd made a decision. If I was going to stand on that stage and present something that carried my name, I was going to own it fully. No more silence. I added one last slide to the end of my deck. No design, no bullet points. Just one sentence in bold, centered. This project was labeled a low-visibility side task. Here's what it really achieved. That day, the room was packed. C-levels, investors, partners. Lights hot on the podium. I walked up with steady legs, but my stomach was in knots. The first part of my presentation went smoothly: results, outcomes, clean visuals, strong engagement numbers. Then I clicked to the final slide. There was a pause. People leaned in. The words were simple, but heavy. I looked up and said, "This wasn't just a side project. It was treated like one, sure. Quietly staffed. No press. No credit given. But it cut our churn rate by 24%, introduced 2 new client verticals, and saved this company nearly $500,000 in support costs." The room stayed silent. My boss looked down. I kept going. If you've ever been sidelined, overlooked, or told your work wasn't critical, even while carrying a full load, this is for you. If that's ever been you, share this story. Speak up. Start there. I didn't need a standing ovation. I wasn't asking for applause. But the fact that people started nodding, whispering to each other, made it clear, I wasn't the only one. I just happened to say it first. After the talk, a younger analyst came up to me. She didn't introduce herself. She just said, "Thank you for saying it. Now I know I'm not crazy." And maybe that's where it really started. The next morning, everything felt off. I walked into the office expecting something. A confrontation, a conversation, maybe even a sarcastic comment. But instead, I got silence. No one said a word about my presentation. Not a single mention from my boss. He wasn't even at his desk. A few coworkers gave me the kind of smile you give someone at a funeral, sympathetic but nervous, like they weren't sure whose side they were allowed to be on. I sat at my desk and opened my inbox. Dozens of emails. But none from management. Most of them came from internal addresses I didn't recognize. No subject lines. No signatures. Just messages like, "I saw what you did yesterday. I wish I'd had the courage. I've been in that exact spot. Thank you for saying it. You weren't wrong." But all anonymous. All quiet. That said everything I needed to know. Everyone knew this was happening, but no one wanted to be the one to call it out. Around midday, I walked into the break room. Two senior managers were standing near the coffee machine. "She really said it out loud," one of them muttered. "She's not wrong though," said the other, looking down. "Just bold. Bold. That's what they called it. Not accurate. Not overdue. Just bold. Like honesty was some radical new idea that required approval." When I got back to my desk, I noticed something on my keyboard. A folded sticky note. No name, just messy handwriting. "I didn't mean to minimize your role. I was trying to manage expectations. I'm sorry if it felt personal." I stared at it. My jaw clenched. It was him. My boss. The one who labeled me low visibility. The one who vanished after the presentation. This was his follow-up? A passive, anonymous note? He didn't have the nerve to say it to my face. And suddenly, I realized, he wasn't sorry I felt small. He was sorry other people noticed. I tucked the note into my drawer. I didn't rip it. I didn't respond. Because some things don't deserve closure. They just deserve distance. Later that day, I was called into a meeting, this time with the VP of Operations. She didn't waste time. "Your presentation hit hard. Not just the numbers, but the message. We've been discussing it upstairs. And we want to explore something with you." I stayed quiet, unsure where this was going. "We're creating a new internal initiative focused on visibility, recognition of behind-the-scenes work. Shadow labor, contribution without credit. We want you to lead it." I blinked. "Me? You started the conversation. Now help us build something from it." I nodded slowly. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a shift. A crack in the surface. They were still playing it safe, but at least they were starting to listen. That evening, I stayed late. Not because I had to. Because I wanted to remember what this felt like, turning discomfort into movement. Being uncomfortable on purpose. I sat alone in the conference room where I delivered the presentation. The lights were dim, the chairs still slightly off angle from earlier. I opened my laptop and began writing. Not a strategy deck. Not a performance summary. Just the truth. I wrote down every time I'd been passed over, every silent dismissal, every small theft of effort. Not for revenge. For memory. So I wouldn't forget what it felt like to be called extra while carrying everything. And I knew, deep down, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The rollout of the Visibility Initiative began quietly. A pilot project. Just a few internal stories submitted by staff across departments, field techs, junior analysts, team assistants. People whose work was always behind the curtain. The idea was simple: every week, we'd highlight one quiet impact story in our internal newsletter. No performance bonuses, no flashy features. Just recognition. A name. A role. A short account of what they did and why it mattered. The response was immediate. People didn't write in for credit. They wrote to nominate others. She kept the entire system running during the outage and never told anyone. He found a critical error in the data and fixed it before the client even noticed. No titles. Just people trying to make each other visible. The project started to grow. One story a week became two. Then we launched a short video series. Each clip was under a minute, just a voiceover with a simple sentence: "This is what I did. This is why it mattered." No faces. No names. Not because people were ashamed, because the story itself was the star. Still, not everyone was supportive. Some executives dismissed it as fluff. One even said, "This feels like a charity project." Another asked, "How does this translate into revenue?" That was the part that made me angriest. Because I knew exactly how it translated. I'd been on the receiving end of invisibility. I knew what it cost, in morale, in retention, in silent burnout. But I didn't fight them. I just let the numbers speak. After 2 months, internal engagement metrics had spiked. Team survey scores rose. People felt heard. That's when the CEO called me into his office. He wasn't known for small talk, and that day was no different. "I watched your presentation again," he said. "The last slide. The one about being labeled low visibility. It's still sitting with me." He paused. "We need more people like you. People who are willing to name what others won't. And we want you to present the project, externally." I blinked. Externally? At the Culture and Leadership Conference next quarter. I should have felt excited. Grateful. Validated. But instead, I felt, still. Because in that moment, I realized something. This had stopped being about me a long time ago. I wasn't just fixing my own narrative anymore. I was holding up a mirror to everyone else who had been written out of theirs. I said yes, of course. And I spent the next month preparing the talk, not about trauma, not about revenge. About the power of unspoken effort. About what companies miss when they only reward what's visible. The day of the conference, I stood backstage and looked out over the room. Rows of leaders. HR directors. Founders. I didn't feel small anymore. I felt rooted. My talk began simply. I used to be labeled as a side project. And the truth is, I let that label sit on me for too long. I thought being quiet was professionalism. It wasn't. It was permission. I told the story. All of it. But then I shifted. Every company has dozens of people like I was. People carrying weight without recognition. And if your business relies on them, but never sees them, you're bleeding value every single day. The room was silent. And then someone clapped. Then another. It wasn't about me anymore. That applause? It was for every story I'd helped lift up. Every person who'd finally felt seen. 3 months after the conference, I found myself in a room I had never been invited to before, not officially, at least. It was the quarterly strategic review, the kind of meeting where the big bets get made, the budgets get set, and decisions ripple through entire departments. I wasn't there as a note-taker this time. I was leading a session. The theme, unseen labor and its impact on core performance. I looked around the table at the familiar faces, people who, a year ago, barely nodded in my direction in the hallway. Now they were listening. Some out of curiosity, some out of obligation, some, I could tell, because they genuinely wanted to understand what had changed. I opened the session with a slide that simply said, "Recognition is not a reward. It's a requirement." There were no dramatic gasps. Just stillness. I walked them through the data. Our internal visibility campaign had not only increased retention in 2 departments by double digits, it had also lowered escalations by 18%. People weren't just staying, they were stepping up. But the part that made the room shift. It wasn't the numbers. It was the stories. I read 3 aloud. Anonymous, powerful, specific. One about a custodian who noticed a leak in the server room and alerted IT before it became a 6-figure disaster. One about a new hire who redesigned a broken onboarding form, cutting processing time in half. One about a night shift operator who kept handwritten logs for 7 months because the system was broken and no one responded to her tickets. And no one knew. Until now. After I finished, the head of finance leaned forward. "How do we scale this?" he asked. "I mean, how do we make this the norm?" That was the moment I knew, this wasn't a trend. It was becoming infrastructure. Later that day, I returned to my office, a new one, recently assigned. Glass walls, plenty of light. A far cry from the windowless corner where I started. There, taped to the inside of a drawer I hadn't opened since moving in, was a folded note. My assistant must have placed it there when packing up my old desk. It was that same note from months ago. "I didn't mean to minimize your role." I read it once, slowly. Then I folded it again and placed it inside a folder labeled Start. Because that's what it had become. Not a reminder of pain, but a bookmark. A signal that something small had cracked open something bigger. A few weeks later, I got an unexpected invitation. The university I'd graduated from wanted me to speak at their alumni leadership forum. Topic: how corporate silence gets broken, and who breaks it first. It was surreal. The same school where I once sat in the back row, too afraid to raise my hand, now wanted me to lead the conversation. The night before the event, I stayed up late reviewing my notes. But they didn't feel necessary anymore. I knew this story by heart. Because it wasn't a script. It was lived. Before heading to bed, I wrote one sentence on a post-it and stuck it to my mirror. Say what no one else is ready to say, and say it well. I looked at myself. Not as someone who had survived being minimized. But as someone who had rewritten what that minimization could become. It was a Friday. Quiet in the office. Most people had signed off early for the weekend. But I stayed behind, sitting at the long table in the new team collaboration room, the same one where, a year ago, I was never invited. On my laptop, the final episode of our internal video series was ready to publish. This one wasn't someone else's story. It was mine. No graphics. No music. Just my voice. I used to be listed under a manager's calendar as non-priority. A side project. Low visibility. And for a long time, I stayed quiet. I told myself that doing the work was what mattered, that recognition would follow, eventually. Pause. But silence isn't strength. Silence, when you've earned your place, is surrender. And I decided I wasn't going to surrender anymore. It was simple. Raw. And it took me 3 attempts to record it without stopping. As I uploaded it to the platform, I stared at the thumbnail, just a still frame of me sitting in front of a plain gray wall, looking into the camera. That image would be shared across departments. It would be sent in emails, embedded in onboarding, shown in meetings I wouldn't even attend. Not because I wanted attention. But because someone needed to say it. Fully. Finally. The next morning, I woke up to messages from places I didn't expect, interns, directors, even someone in another country's office who said, "Your voice helped me find mine." That hit deeper than any applause ever could. I didn't just get my visibility back. I gave others permission to find theirs. A few weeks later, during our annual town hall, the CEO shared a list of company-wide initiatives for the next year. At the top of the list, Project Echo, a formal framework for recognizing unseen contributions across every team. It was based on the pilot I started. And it had my name on the blueprint. After the event, I stood in the back corner, sipping water, trying not to let the weight of it all show. One of our regional managers came up beside me and said, "You know, when I saw your first talk, I thought, this is going to stir trouble. But now I see, trouble's what we needed." I smiled. Sometimes, the right kind of trouble builds the right kind of change. That evening, walking home, I passed the same glass building I used to see from the sidewalk when I worked in a tiny cubicle. I used to glance at those corner offices and wonder what it would feel like to be heard from up there. Now I know. It doesn't come from title. Or privilege. Or waiting for your turn. It comes from speaking when it's hardest. And refusing to let the silence win. So if you're reading this, or watching, or listening, and you've ever felt like your work didn't matter just because no one clapped, I want you to do something. Tell your story. You don't need a stage. You don't need permission. You just need one clear sentence that says, "This is what I did. This is why it mattered." Because once you say it out loud, the silence loses its power. And you? You're no one's side project.